The courtroom was heavy with silence, the air so thick with tension it seemed as though the very walls were closing in. Officer Victor Malone stood there, his uniform immaculate and his stance rigid, radiating nothing but arrogance. His cold, defiant eyes were fixed upon the woman seated in the judge's chair, as if she had no rightful claim to that position, as though her authority was something he utterly refused to acknowledge. In that charged moment, every onlooker felt the weight of unspoken challenge hanging in the space between them. Judge Serena Carter, known for her unwavering commitment to justice and her fierce determination to protect the vulnerable, had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the most respected figures in the district. Born into a working-class family in a city that had long struggled with inequality, she had faced her share of prejudice and doubt. Yet, with a resolute spirit and an iron will, she had carved her way through the labyrinth of a system that was often rigged against people like her. Today, as she sat calmly upon the bench, she was not merely presiding over a trial, she was defending the very idea that no one, regardless of rank or influence, was above the law. Officer Malone, on the other hand, was the embodiment of a bygone era. A veteran of the force for over 15 years, he had built his career on an unyielding belief in his own invincibility. His demeanor exuded the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked power and a deep-seated prejudice that he wore like a badge. Malone had long believed that his authority was sacrosanct, that his actions, however misguided, were justified by a sense of entitlement and superiority. His eyes now, fixed on Judge Carter, betrayed not only disdain but a desperate need to assert control. The trial that day had been one of the most anticipated in recent memory. Malone was not on trial for his actions, rather, he had been summoned to testify in a case that sought to expose systemic corruption within the police department. However, Malone's presence was charged with irony. Here he was, a man who had spent his life upholding a system that now faced scrutiny, standing in the very room where the scales of justice were meant to balance truth and fairness. As the proceedings unfolded, murmurs of anticipation and anxiety rippled through the courtroom. Every detail was magnified, every gesture, every inflection of voice carried a weight that transcended the immediate case. Judge Carter began the session with a calm yet commanding tone. She recited the legal formalities with precision and then turned her attention to the witnesses. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and for those who had followed her career, it was clear that she would not tolerate any disrespect or deviation from the truth. Malone's eyes narrowed as she spoke, his posture stiffening further. There was a moment of palpable standoff between them, a silent battle of wills that set the stage for the drama that was about to unfold. As the hearing progressed, Judge Carter's meticulous questioning began to chip away at Malone's carefully constructed facade. She probed into the details of his past actions, his decision-making during critical incidents, and the numerous complaints that had been lodged against him over the years. Malone's responses were curt and laced with defiance. His tone, though measured at first, slowly began to reveal a simmering rage. It was as if each question from the judge was a spark, igniting memories of past transgressions that he had long tried to bury beneath the veneer of professionalism. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing minute. The spectators, comprised of lawyers, clerks, and members of the public, leaned forward in their seats, caught between a sense of disbelief and a mounting anticipation of what might happen next. Malone's colleagues in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances. Some had witnessed his behavior in the past and knew that he prided himself on being untouchable. Yet, in that moment, something in the air signaled that the long-held balance of power was about to shift. It happened in a flash. One moment, Malone was sitting rigidly in his chair, his eyes burning with defiant fury. The next, as Judge Carter's voice resonated through the courtroom, steady, clear, and unyielding, he sprang to his feet. His hand, seemingly acting on instinct and fueled by years of repressed rage, shot forward. In a single, violent motion, his fist connected with Judge Carter's face. The impact reverberated through the room like a thunderclap, shattering the illusion of order that had held the courtroom together. Time seemed to slow as shockwaves of disbelief rippled across every face present. Papers fluttered to the ground, and a collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Judge Carter staggered, her head snapping to the side as pain surged through her features. But even in that moment of physical assault, she did not crumble. Instead, with a fierce determination that left no room for weakness, she raised her head, blood trickling from the corner of her lip. Her eyes, now burning with a mix of indignation and resolve, met Malone's with a gaze that communicated an unyielding promise of retribution. "Officer Malone," she said, her voice as calm as it had been before yet imbued with an intensity that silenced every whispered comment, "you have just violated the sanctity of this court. You have just assaulted a judge in her own chamber. Stand down immediately, or you will face the full force of the law." Her words were like a clarion call, cutting through the chaos that had erupted in the courtroom. For a moment, Malone's smug expression faltered. His eyes, which had once radiated invincibility, now flickered with uncertainty. The room was frozen in a state of suspended animation as security personnel surged forward. Officers who had long shared Malone's creed of untouchability now found themselves in a dilemma, torn between loyalty to a colleague and the imperative to uphold justice. In that charged moment, the unthinkable became reality. The man who had spent his entire career believing he was above reproach was being forcibly subdued. The arrest was swift and merciless. As Malone was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of murmurs and stunned silence. Judge Carter, still composed despite the pain, resumed her seat and raised her gavel. The sound of the gavel striking its block echoed like a verdict that was both a condemnation and a promise. It signified that no one, no matter how entrenched in power, was immune from accountability. Outside the courtroom, the fallout was immediate and explosive. News vans gathered like vultures beneath the imposing steps of the courthouse. Cameras flashed relentlessly as reporters clamored for statements. Social media platforms were set ablaze with footage and commentary, and within hours, the incident had become a national headline. The story of Officer Malone, the self-proclaimed enforcer who had dared to challenge the authority of a resolute judge, was dissected from every conceivable angle. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some hailed Judge Carter as a hero, a symbol of resistance against entrenched systems of privilege and corruption. Others, loyal to the old guard of law enforcement, denounced her actions as an affront to authority and a spark that threatened to incite further unrest. Political pundits debated the implications of the incident on national security and the integrity of the justice system. The arrest of Officer Malone was not merely a punitive measure, it was a catalyst that exposed deep fractures within the institutions that govern society. In the days that followed, internal memos and statements from various branches of law enforcement began to emerge. The police union, known for its unwavering support of its members, found itself caught in a delicate balancing act. On one hand, there was an obligation to stand by their own, on the other, the growing public outcry demanded accountability. In closed-door meetings, heated discussions took place. Some officers, previously unquestioning in their loyalty, began to express doubts about the unchallenged authority that had defined their careers for so long. Judge Carter, meanwhile, became the subject of both fierce admiration and relentless vilification. In interviews with national media, she spoke with measured clarity about the need for reform and the importance of maintaining the rule of law. She recounted the long, arduous journey that had brought her to that bench, a journey marked by sacrifices, obstacles, and moments of profound personal loss. Every word she uttered carried the weight of someone who had fought tirelessly against a system that was rigged against the marginalized. And yet, she remained undeterred by those who sought to undermine her credibility or portray her as a provocateur. Among the many voices in the aftermath was that of a seasoned investigative journalist named Daniel Reyes. Known for his relentless pursuit of truth, Daniel had been covering the story from the very beginning. As he pieced together the events of that fateful day, he uncovered a trove of evidence suggesting that Officer Malone's actions were not an isolated incident but the culmination of years of misconduct, cover-ups, and a culture of impunity. In a series of hard-hitting exposés, Daniel documented the hidden realities of a police department that had long operated with minimal oversight. His work became a rallying cry for reform and ignited a movement demanding transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Meanwhile, within the very corridors of power, whispers of retribution began to circulate. High-ranking officials in the police department and city government convened emergency meetings. There was talk of sweeping reforms, of overhauling internal protocols, and even of launching independent investigations into the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Malone to thrive. Yet, for many in those circles, the incident was a bitter reminder that the old ways were crumbling. The untouchable had been brought low, and the long-held illusion of immunity was beginning to shatter. As the days turned into weeks, the trial of Officer Malone loomed large on the horizon. The courtroom that had witnessed the dramatic altercation was now a stage for an even more profound reckoning. Malone's defense team, known for their aggressive tactics, prepared for a battle that would not only determine his fate but also set a precedent for future cases involving misconduct. In heated press conferences, legal experts debated the potential ramifications of the trial. Some argued that a harsh sentence was necessary to restore public faith in the justice system, while others cautioned that a misstep could fuel further divisions in an already polarized society. Judge Carter continued to preside over the court with the same steadfast resolve that had defined her career. Every day in the courtroom was a reminder of the high stakes involved. For her, the trial was personal, not because she sought revenge, but because it represented the culmination of decades of struggle against an oppressive system. Each question she asked, every piece of evidence she scrutinized, was an affirmation that justice would not be compromised. Her measured tone and unwavering gaze instilled a sense of order even as the proceedings grew more intense. Outside the courthouse, public demonstrations erupted. Protesters gathered in front of the building, waving banners that called for justice, transparency, and an end to police brutality. The chants of the crowd, rhythmic and impassioned, resonated through the city streets. For many, the trial of Officer Malone had become a symbol of hope, a beacon that even those who had long operated with unchecked power could be held accountable. At the same time, there were voices of dissent among groups who believed that the entire episode was a politically motivated spectacle, designed to undermine law enforcement and destabilize the community. In one particularly charged moment during the trial, as Malone's past transgressions were laid bare on the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom became almost unbearable. A key witness, a former colleague of Malone's, recounted in harrowing detail how Malone had once disregarded the very principles of integrity he was sworn to uphold. The witness described a scene from years earlier, a chaotic night when Malone had used excessive force during a routine arrest, leaving a man grievously injured. The testimony was graphic, and as the details unfolded, several members of the public in the gallery could be seen wiping away tears. It was a moment that underscored the human cost of unchecked power and the urgent need for systemic change. Even as the trial reached its climax, the ripple effects of that violent act continued to reverberate across the nation. Political leaders, social activists, and everyday citizens engaged in impassioned debates about the future of law enforcement and the rights of those who had long been marginalized. The incident had become more than just a courtroom drama, it had transformed into a national conversation about accountability, respect, and the inherent dignity of every human being. The media played a pivotal role in shaping the narrative. Every major network and online platform featured interviews, opinion pieces, and roundtable discussions dissecting the incident from every possible angle. In editorials, commentators argued that Officer Malone's downfall was a necessary corrective to a system that had protected its own at the expense of justice. Others warned that the fervor surrounding the case might lead to unintended consequences, sparking a backlash that could endanger the very institutions that were meant to serve and protect. Amid all this turmoil, Judge Carter remained a solitary figure of calm determination. Late at night, in the quiet solitude of her chambers, she would pore over case files and legal briefs, preparing herself for the next phase of the battle. She understood that the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Powerful forces were arrayed against her, determined to discredit her and reverse the tide of reform. But in her heart, she knew that her actions that day in the courtroom had been a turning point, a moment when the scales of justice had begun to tilt in favor of accountability. As the trial drew to a close, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The jury, having listened to weeks of testimony and examined mountains of evidence, finally reached their verdict. The foreman stood and, with a heavy heart, pronounced that Officer Victor Malone was guilty on all counts. In that moment, the gavel came down one final time, sealing the fate of the man who had long considered himself untouchable. The silence that followed was profound, as if the entire nation was holding its breath, waiting for the repercussions of this historic judgment to unfold. For Malone, the verdict was a crushing blow. As he was led away in handcuffs, his eyes, once so full of defiant arrogance, now betrayed a hint of disbelief and despair. The man who had once wielded his badge like a weapon and believed that he was beyond reproach was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a living embodiment of the consequences of unchecked power. In that moment, the corridors of power, the once impenetrable bastions of authority, had begun to crumble, revealing the fragility of a system built on the illusion of invincibility. In the days that followed, the story of Officer Malone dominated headlines. His arrest and subsequent conviction became a rallying point for advocates of reform, while also serving as a stark warning to those who believed that authority granted immunity. Social media exploded with commentary and debate, and the courthouse itself became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice. As citizens from all walks of life shared their thoughts and experiences, a collective realization began to take shape: true justice was not a privilege reserved for the powerful, but a right that must be defended at all costs. Now, as you reflect on this story, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you find the trial a turning point in the fight for accountability? How do you think the events in this case will shape the future of our justice system? Your insights and ratings are important in keeping the conversation alive, so please let us know what you think. The aftermath of the trial also brought to light the internal struggles within the police department. Whispers of reform were met with resistance from entrenched interests, and the police union found itself in a precarious position. Meetings were held behind closed doors, where senior officers debated how best to preserve their traditional privileges while addressing growing public outcry. Some called for sweeping changes, including independent oversight committees and mandatory training on implicit bias. Others argued that the incident was an aberration, a moment of uncontrolled emotion that did not reflect the overall integrity of the force. Yet, as more evidence of past misconduct emerged, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the need for systemic reform. Judge Serena Carter, despite the storm of controversy swirling around her, maintained her focus on the principles of fairness and justice. In private interviews, she spoke of the long journey that had led her to this moment, a journey marked by hardship, resilience, and an unyielding belief in the rule of law. She recalled the many times when she had been dismissed or belittled because of her background and her determination to stand up for what was right. Her words resonated with countless individuals who had felt marginalized by a system that often seemed indifferent to their suffering. The trial of Officer Malone thus became not only a legal battle but a symbolic struggle between two very different visions of authority. On one side was the old order, a system that had long operated on the basis of power, privilege, and fear. On the other was a new vision, one that recognized the inherent worth of every individual and demanded that those entrusted with power be held accountable for their actions. The clash of these ideals played out in every testimony, every piece of evidence, and every public statement in the days that followed. For many, the fall of Officer Malone was a cathartic moment, a vindication of the countless voices that had cried out for justice in the face of systemic abuse. For others, it was a moment of deep uncertainty, raising questions about what the future held for law enforcement and the communities they served. Yet, amid the conflicting narratives, one thing remained clear: the events in that courtroom had irrevocably altered the landscape of power and accountability. In the weeks that followed the verdict, protests and vigils were held across the city. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens came together to demand further reforms and to honor the memory of those who had suffered at the hands of unchecked authority. The courthouse, once a symbol of an old regime, now stood as a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of collective action. Throughout the city, murals and slogans emerged, each one echoing the sentiment that justice, though hard-fought, was within reach. Even within the halls of law enforcement, there was a growing recognition that change was necessary. Several high-ranking officials began advocating for policies that would increase transparency and accountability. New training programs on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias were introduced, and proposals for civilian oversight boards gained traction. Although there was resistance from some quarters, the momentum for change was undeniable. The fall of Officer Malone had sparked a debate that could no longer be ignored, a debate about how to rebuild trust between the police and the communities they were meant to protect. As the nation continued to grapple with the repercussions of the trial, Judge Serena Carter found herself at the center of a national conversation about the future of justice. Invitations to speak at conferences, panels, and televised debates poured in. She spoke with measured passion about the importance of upholding the rule of law and ensuring that every individual, regardless of their position or influence, was held to the same standards. Her words resonated with millions, inspiring a new generation of legal professionals and activists to continue the fight for a fairer, more just society. In the midst of this turbulent period, one could not help but notice the personal toll that the events had taken on all involved. Officer Malone, once so full of conviction and pride, now faced the stark reality of a life defined by shame and regret. His career, his reputation, and the very identity he had constructed over years of service were in ruins. In the quiet moments before his trial, he was said to have stared blankly at the ceiling, haunted by the knowledge that his actions had not only destroyed his own life but had also left a lasting scar on the community he had once sworn to protect. Judge Carter, too, bore the weight of the battle she had fought. Every night, as she reviewed case files and prepared for the next day in court, she was reminded of the countless obstacles she had overcome and the sacrifices she had made along the way. Yet, even as the challenges mounted, she remained resolute, driven by the belief that true justice was worth every hardship. Now, as we look back on the events that unfolded in that fateful courtroom, the story of Officer Malone and Judge Serena Carter stands as a powerful reminder of the transformative potential of accountability. It is a story of a system put to the test, a system where the fall of an untouchable man paved the way for a new era of transparency and fairness. It is a story that challenges us all to question our own assumptions about power and authority, and to demand that those entrusted with upholding the law do so with integrity and respect for the dignity of every human being. If this narrative stirred something within you, if you believe that justice must be upheld at all costs, then I invite you to share your thoughts and rate this story in the comments below. Your feedback is not only appreciated but essential in continuing the dialogue about accountability and reform. Let us know whether you think this turning point is just the beginning of a broader transformation or if there are still many battles to be fought in the quest for true justice. The shattering of the untouchable is more than just a tale of retribution, it is a chronicle of the human spirit standing up to a force that had long thrived on unchallenged power. It is a story of hope emerging from the darkness of corruption and of the relentless pursuit of a system that values every life equally. As we move forward, may this story serve as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that when courage and conviction meet, even the mightiest of institutions can be made to tremble. In the end, the legacy of that courtroom showdown will not be measured solely by the fall of one officer, but by the awakening of an entire community that refused to accept injustice as the norm. It is a legacy built on the belief that every act of defiance in the face of tyranny is a step toward a future where accountability and compassion prevail. And it is a call to action for all of us to stand up, to speak out, and to never allow the forces of oppression to silence the voice of justice. Thank you for reading this narrative. If you found the story compelling, please leave your comments and ratings below. Let us know what you think about the fall of the untouchable and whether you believe this marks the beginning of a new era of accountability. Your opinion matters, and together, we can help shape a future where justice is truly served.